A werewolf romance audiobook written by Mr. Dave. The grand ballroom reeked of leather and ambition. Power. The kind of scent that made my wolf tuck her tail and hide in the darkest recesses of my consciousness. I pressed myself against the stone pillar near the entrance, my fingers clutching the coarse wool of my cloak, watching the spectacle unfold with the same morbid curiosity one might watch a storm gather before it destroys everything in its path. Every unmated she-wolf from the 4 territories had been commanded to appear. Not invited. Commanded. When the Frost King issues a decree, you don't send your regrets with a polite note. The flagstone beneath my feet was frigid, even through my boots. I tried to clean them this morning, scraping away weeks of dirt and wear, attempting to look like I belonged among these daughters of pack leaders and warlords. Women who glided through the crowd like they owned every shadow they cast. Their hair cascaded down their backs. Midnight black, burnished gold, flame red. Each style more elaborate than the last, nothing like my own ash-brown waves that I'd barely managed to twist into something acceptable. Don't slouch. My cousin Mira had snapped at me before we entered. For once, try not to make us look pathetic. Pathetic. The word had been my companion since childhood, since the day my wolf first surfaced. Undersized, gray-furred, with uncertain movements and a howl that barely carried across a field. Nothing like Myra's wolf, all amber power and beta bloodlines, nothing like anyone's, really. I watched the king from my position near the wall, and my breath stuttered despite my best efforts. He stood on the raised platform surrounded by his elite guard, and he looked exactly like the legends warned. Towering, pale-haired, with features that might have been carved from ice itself, and eyes the color of a winter sky before snowfall. Eyes that could freeze your blood with a single look. Theron Frost. The name alone made wolves across 4 territories lower their eyes and expose their throats in submission. He'd claimed the throne at 20 after his father's brutal assassination, and in the 8 years since, he'd crushed uprisings, absorbed rival packs, and remained utterly, impossibly unmated. No queen, no mate, no vulnerability. They say he executed the last woman who tried to trap him with a false bond claim. Someone whispered nearby. I didn't look to see who. The rumors had been spreading all month, each more dramatic than the last. Some said he was cursed by a witch. Others claimed he simply had standards no she-wolf could meet. A few whispered darker things, that he'd loved once, and that love had broken something inside him so completely he'd rather rule alone than risk it again. I didn't know which story held truth. I only knew that his gaze was currently sweeping the ballroom with the mechanical precision of a predator selecting prey, and my heart hammered so violently I was certain the wolves nearest me could hear it. The king will evaluate each of you individually, announced his second-in-command, a battle-scarred wolf named Kieran whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary even in the outer territories. When called, you will approach. You will answer truthfully. You will not waste his time. The first name echoed through the chamber. Celine Nightshade. A breathtaking blonde, golden radiant, everything I wasn't, moved forward with practiced grace. I watched her curtsy, watched how she angled her throat in submission, while somehow managing to appear seductive rather than weak. The king spoke to her for perhaps 20 seconds before dismissing her with a slight gesture. She returned to the crowd with her head high, but I caught the tremor in her hands. One by one they were summoned. One by one they were sent away. I tried to calm my spiraling thoughts, but they raced ahead anyway. What was I even doing here? I wasn't like these women. I didn't come from powerful bloodlines or possess the kind of strength that could stand beside a king. I was the forgotten niece, the one mentioned in disappointed whispers, the one whose own pack barely remembered she existed. My uncle had made his position clear when the summons arrived. Don't humiliate us, he'd said without looking up from his maps. Keep your head down and stay silent. The memory still burned. Lyra Shenvale. My name. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. My legs had turned to ice, my lungs to stone. Then Myra's elbow jabbed into my ribs, sharp, impatient, and I stumbled forward on numb feet. The crowd parted like water, and suddenly there was nothing between me and the platform except 40 feet of polished stone and my own thundering pulse. I forced myself to walk steadily, though I felt hundreds of eyes tracking my every movement, judging each step, each breath. Up close, the Frost King was even more terrifying. He towered over me by more than a foot, all broad shoulders and coiled power barely contained by the formal ice-blue tunic he wore. His hair was pale as moonlight, swept back from a face that might have been beautiful if it weren't so severe. But it was his eyes that stopped me, pale blue-gray like winter sky before a blizzard, deep and dangerous. Name, he said, though he clearly already knew it. Lyra Ashenvale, Your Majesty. My voice emerged steadier than I'd expected. Small miracle. Pack. Stonehaven, Your Majesty. Rank. I hesitated. This was where it always fell apart. My uncle leads the border patrols. I assist with supply coordination. Something flickered in those cold eyes. Not quite amusement, but close. You're unmated. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes, Your Majesty. Why? The bluntness startled me. Around us, I felt the attention of the entire ballroom focus like a blade edge. This was the question that had haunted me for years. The one my pack asked with their silences and sidelong looks. The one I'd asked myself 1,000 times while lying awake in the dark. I don't know, Your Majesty. The truth felt like failure on my tongue. He studied me for a long moment, and I fought the urge to drop my gaze. Something told me he'd consider that an insult, or worse, confirmation that I was exactly as weak as everyone claimed. Do you have someone? He asked, and there was something strange in his voice now. Something that made my wolf stir for the first time since entering this ballroom. The question seemed redundant after what we'd just discussed, but I sensed the weight behind it was different somehow. He wasn't asking if I was mated. He was asking if I had someone somewhere waiting for me, someone I belonged to even without the bond sealed. Not yet, I whispered. The change was instantaneous. His entire body went rigid, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Those pale eyes that had been merely intimidating moments before now blazed with something I couldn't name. Something wild and possessive and barely controlled. Not yet, he repeated, his voice dropping to a growl that reverberated through my bones. Explain. I blinked, confused by the sudden shift. I only meant I'm not promised to anyone, Your Majesty. There's no arrangement, no understanding. I'm unmated and available. Available, he said, as if testing the word. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. You consider yourself available? Yes. It came out as a question because I genuinely didn't understand what I'd said wrong. He leaned forward slightly, and I caught his scent, pine and frost and something darker, like smoke from a dying fire that had burned too long. And if someone were to claim you, if someone were to decide you belonged to them, would you still consider yourself available then? My heart raced again, but differently now. There was a challenge in his words. And beneath that challenge, something that almost sounded like jealousy. No, that was impossible. I would belong to my mate, I said carefully. When the bond chooses. The bond, he cut me off with a laugh that held no humor. Tell me, Lyra Ashenvale of Stonehaven, do you believe the bond is always right? That fate knows better than we do who we're meant to stand beside. It felt like a test, like every word I spoke was being weighed against some standard I couldn't see. I believe, I said slowly, that the bond can surprise us. That sometimes strength isn't what we expect it to be. The words came from somewhere deep, from the part of me that had spent years being overlooked and underestimated. The part that had learned to find power in quiet competence when the world demanded claws and dominance. For the first time since I'd approached the platform, the Frost King's expression shifted. The rage, or whatever that fierce emotion had been, didn't disappear, but it changed. Transformed into something that looked almost like recognition. Step back, he said quietly. I obeyed, retreating 3 paces as protocol demanded. But as I turned to rejoin the crowd, I heard him speak again, so softly I almost thought I'd imagined it. Not yet, she said. Not yet. The dismissal should have been a relief. I should have been grateful to escape those winter sky eyes and return to anonymity. Instead, I felt the weight of his gaze follow me across the flagstone floor like a physical touch, burning between my shoulder blades with an intensity that made my wolf pace restlessly beneath my skin. What did you say to him? Mira grabbed my arm the moment I reached the back wall, her nails digging through the thin fabric of my sleeve. Her perfect features twisted with something between curiosity and accusation. He looked at you like, I've never seen him look at anyone like that. I don't know what you mean. The lie tasted bitter. I knew exactly what she meant because I'd seen it too. That moment when something had shifted in his expression, when the cold king had cracked just enough to reveal something raw underneath. You did something, she insisted, shaking me slightly. Lyra, if you've somehow insulted him, if you've made our pack look. I answered his questions. I interrupted, pulling free. That's all. Just like everyone else. But it wasn't like everyone else, and we both knew it. The procession continued. More names called, more women dismissed. but now there was a tension crackling through the air that hadn't existed before. A charge like lightning about to strike. The king's questions grew shorter, his demeanor even colder. He barely looked at the women who approached him, waving them away after mere seconds. When the last name was called and the final dismissal given, Kieran stepped forward again. The king will make his selection by nightfall. All unmated females will remain in the fortress until then. You are dismissed to the guest quarters. The crowd began to disperse, breaking into clusters of whispered speculation. I tried to slip away quietly, to find whatever small room had been assigned to someone of my insignificant rank. But a hand caught my wrist. Not Mira this time. A fortress guard, his expression neutral, but his grip firm. Lyra Shenvale. My stomach dropped. Yes. The king requests your presence in the North Tower Library. Immediately. The whispers around us cut off as if sliced by a blade. I felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward me, felt the weight of their shock and speculation and envy. Myra's face had gone pale, then flushed with something that looked dangerously like rage. There must be some mistake, I managed. No mistake. Follow me. He didn't wait for agreement, just turned and began walking. I had no choice but to follow, my boots clicking against the stone in a rhythm that sounded too much like a countdown. Chapter 2. The Truth Beneath the Ice. We left the grand ballroom, moving through corridors lined with tapestries depicting previous Frost kings. All of them fierce, all of them crowned, all of them looking down at me with expressions that seemed to ask what someone like me was doing in their fortress. The North Tower Library was nothing like the modest collection of supply ledgers and patrol reports in Stonehaven. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched toward a vaulted ceiling painted with winter constellations, and the scent of old parchment and leather filled the air. Late afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting golden light across reading tables and deep armchairs. And standing by the window, silhouetted against the brightness, was the king. He'd removed his formal tunic. Now he wore only a white shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with scars and the dark lines of what looked like ancient pack symbols. He didn't turn when I entered, didn't acknowledge the guard's murmured announcement of my arrival. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped in front of me, trying to control my breathing, trying to understand why I was here alone with the most dangerous wolf in all 4 territories. Do you know why I called this gathering? His voice was quieter now, without the formal edge it had held in the ballroom. To find a queen, I answered. It was what everyone knew, what the decree had implied without stating directly. To find a mate, he corrected, finally turning to face me. The afternoon light caught in his pale hair, softened the hard lines of his face just slightly. There's a difference. I waited, sensing he had more to say. A queen is a title, a position, a political alliance. He moved away from the window, prowling closer with that predatory grace that made my pulse spike. A mate is something else entirely. Something I've been told I'll never have again. Your Majesty, I don't understand why I'm. Not yet, he interrupted, and there was that strange intensity again, the one that had flared in the ballroom. You said not yet, when I asked if you had someone. As if it's inevitable. As if you're simply waiting for the right moment, the right person. I swallowed hard. Isn't that what we all hope for? That the bond will find us when we're ready. Hope. He laughed, but it was a broken sound. I stopped hoping 8 years ago, Lyra Shenvale. I stopped believing in bonds and fate, and all the pretty lies we tell ourselves about destined pairs. There was a story there, hidden beneath the bitterness. A wound that hadn't healed despite the years. Then why hold a gathering? I dared to ask. Why search for something you don't believe in? He stopped pacing, studying me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Because a king needs an heir. Because my council demands it. Because apparently ruling 4 territories with an iron fist isn't enough. I also need to produce the next generation of frost wolves to satisfy the old traditions. The cynicism in his words should have repelled me. Instead, I heard the loneliness underneath it, the exhaustion of carrying so much weight alone. That's not a good reason to choose someone, I said softly. His eyes snapped to mine, sharp as winter wind. No. Then tell me what would be a good reason. The question hung between us, dangerous and intimate. I thought of my own years of isolation, of being overlooked and underestimated, of lying awake wondering if there was something fundamentally wrong with me that kept the bond from forming. Choosing someone who sees you, I whispered. Not your title or your power or what you can give them. Just you. Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the armor, brief but unmistakable. He moved closer. Close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. Close enough that his scent wrapped around me like smoke. And do you see me, little wolf? His voice had dropped to a rumble that I felt in my bones. When you look at me, what do you see? I should have said my king. Should have dropped my gaze and murmured something appropriate and safe. Instead, the truth spilled out before I could stop it. I see someone who's tired of being alone, but doesn't know how to let anyone close. Someone who's built walls so high he's forgotten what it feels like to be touched without flinching. Someone who's... I trailed off, realizing I'd gone too far. Someone who's what? He pressed, and now there was something almost desperate in his tone. Someone who's afraid, I finished quietly. Just like me. The silence that followed was absolute. I'd crossed a line. I knew at the moment the words left my mouth. You don't tell the Frost King he's afraid. You don't suggest that someone who'd crushed uprisings and absorbed rival packs might be vulnerable in any way. I waited for his anger, for the dismissal that would send me back to Stonehaven in disgrace. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and caught a strand of my ash-brown hair that had escaped its twist. He rubbed it between his fingers as if testing the texture, his expression distant. My mate, he said finally, died 2 weeks before our bonding ceremony. Assassinated by wolves who thought I was too young to rule, who wanted to break me before I could consolidate power. My breath caught. The rumor had been true, or at least one version of it. They succeeded, he continued, his voice devoid of emotion now. Not in taking my throne, but in breaking something inside me. I hunted down every wolf involved, made examples of them that are still whispered about in warning. And when it was done, when I'd secured my position and eliminated every threat, I realized I'd also eliminated any chance of feeling that way again. Of being that open. I'm sorry, I whispered, inadequate as the words were. He let my hair slip through his fingers. Don't be. It made me stronger. Made me the kind of king these territories need. One who doesn't hesitate, doesn't show mercy to enemies, doesn't have weaknesses that can be exploited. Is that really strength? I asked before I could stop myself. Or is it just safer? His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought I'd pushed too far. Then, incredibly, his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't completely cold either. You're either very brave or very foolish, Lyra Shenvale. Probably both, I admitted. This time he did smile, barely, just a slight quirk at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his face. Made him look younger, less like a marble statue, and more like a man who might once have laughed easily before the world taught him not to. The bond didn't choose me, he said abruptly. When she died, I felt it snap. Felt the potential of what we might have been just dissolve. I've spent 8 years certain it would never happen again. That whatever fate decides these things had looked at me and decided I'd had my chance. But, I prompted, sensing there was more. He stepped back, creating distance, and the loss of his nearness felt physical. But when you stood before me in that ballroom, when you said not yet with such certainty, as if you knew without question that your mate was coming, he shook his head. Something in me wanted to destroy whoever you're waiting for. Wanted to prove that you were wrong to sound so sure, so hopeful. The confession was raw, almost violent in its honesty. I'm not waiting for anyone specific, I said carefully. I just meant I believe the bond will find me someday. That I won't always be alone. Such faith, he murmured. I remember having that. Before. We stood in the golden afternoon light, 2 wolves who'd learned loneliness in different ways. Him through loss, me through never being chosen at all. The silence between us felt less heavy now, more like understanding than discomfort. Why did you really summon me here? I asked finally. He turned back to the window, his profile sharp against the brightness. Because when I looked at you, I felt something I haven't felt in 8 years. And I needed to know if it was real or just wishful thinking from a wolf who's tired of ruling alone. My heart hammered. Is it real? I don't know, he admitted. But I know that I want to find out. That for the first time since her death, I'm curious about something other than strategy and power and survival. He looked at me over his shoulder, and the vulnerability in his expression stole my breath. Stay, he said. Not as a candidate for queen or a political alliance. Just stay. Let me understand what it is about you that makes me feel less cold. It wasn't a command, despite his position. It was a request, maybe even a plea. And as I stood there in the North Tower Library with the Frost King looking at me like I was something precious and terrifying all at once, I realized my answer had been decided the moment he'd first met my eyes in the ballroom. Yes, I whispered. I'll stay. Chapter 3, Breaking Barriers. The days that followed existed in a strange suspended reality, as if the fortress had become its own world with rules I was still learning to navigate. The other unmated females had been dismissed the evening after the gathering, sent back to their packs with varying degrees of disappointment and relief. I'd watched them depart from a window in the guest wing, Myra's furious glare burning into me even from the courtyard below. She hadn't spoken to me since the king's request became known. None of my pack had. The message from my uncle had been brief and cold: don't fail us. No words of encouragement, no curiosity about what was happening. Just the familiar weight of expectation pressing down on my shoulders. But here in the fortress, I wasn't the disappointing niece or the weak wolf. I was simply Lyra, and the king, Theron, as he'd asked me to call him when we were alone, seemed determined to understand exactly who that was. He didn't court me in any traditional sense. There were no formal dinners or carefully chaperoned walks through gardens. Instead, he invited me to places that felt private, almost sacred. The library became our refuge. We'd sit in companionable silence while he worked through reports, and I explored shelves filled with texts about supply routes and territorial management I'd never encountered in Stonehaven. Sometimes he'd ask my opinion on disputes between border patrols, listening with surprising intensity as I fumbled through answers about efficiency and resource allocation, concepts that seemed foreign to a king who'd built his reputation on absolute authority. You think too much about what others need, he'd observed one evening, looking up from a document about trade agreements. Don't you ever consider what you want? I'd set down the logistics manual I'd been studying, considering his question carefully. I suppose I've never had the luxury of wanting things. In my pack, I was always trying to be useful enough that they'd keep me around. His expression had darkened. Keep you around? You speak as if you're something disposable. To them I was. The admission hurt less than I expected. Maybe because here, in this space we'd created, the old wounds seemed to matter less. My wolf is small. I'm not a fighter. I can't shift as quickly as others, can't run as far. The only value I had was in making sure supplies reached the right patrols at the right time. Theron had leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. What value do you think you have now? It had felt like another test, but I was learning that his tests were never about finding the right answer. They were about understanding how I thought, what I believed when no one was forcing me to be something I wasn't. I think, I'd said slowly, that maybe value isn't something someone else assigns to you. Maybe it's something you decide for yourself. He'd smiled then, that rare slight curve of his mouth that I was learning to treasure, and returned to his work without another word. But his hand had reached across the table to brush against mine, just for a moment, and the touch had sent warmth racing through my veins. The fortress staff had noticed, of course. Servants whispered in corners when I passed, and the council members who occasionally glimpsed me in the corridors wore expressions that ranged from confusion to outright hostility. Kieran was the worst. His scarred face would twist into something like disgust whenever our paths crossed, as if my very presence offended him. He doesn't trust easily, Theron had explained when I'd mentioned it. He's been with me since the beginning, since the night my mate was killed. He watched me hunt down her assassins, watched me become something harder than I'd been before. To him, anyone who threatens to soften those edges is a danger. And am I? I'd asked. Dangerous to you? He'd looked at me for a long moment, and I'd seen something like fear flicker in his eyes. Terrifyingly so. But it was Kieran's mate, Senna, who became my unexpected ally. She'd found me in the training courtyard 5 days after the others had left, her approach silent despite the twin daggers strapped to her thighs. She was a lean woman with copper hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. You're wondering why he chose you, she'd said without preamble, settling onto the bench beside me. I'd tensed, unsure if this was an attack or simply observation. Kieran thinks you're manipulating him somehow, playing at innocence to trap a king. She'd said it matter-of-factly, watching the guards spar in the yard. I told him he's an idiot. Despite myself, I'd smiled. And what do you think? I think Theron sees something in you that reminds him of who he was before the darkness. Before he decided that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything. She'd turned those keen eyes on me. I also think you're more terrified than anyone realizes, but you're too stubborn to run. The accuracy of her assessment had stolen my breath. He's been alone for so long, Senna had continued quietly. We've all watched him become colder, harder. Watched him choose duty over everything else because it was the only thing that didn't hurt. And then you walked into that ballroom and something in him woke up. It scared him. It scared all of us. I'm not trying to trap him, I'd said, needing her to understand. I don't even know what I'm doing here. Every day I expect him to realize I'm not special, that I'm just. Stop, she'd interrupted firmly. Whatever you think you're lacking, he doesn't see it that way. He looks at you like you're water, and he's been dying of thirst. Like you're sunlight, and he's been trapped in winter for 8 years. The words had made my chest ache with something too big to name. Be patient with Kieran, Senna had said, rising gracefully. He'll come around once he realizes you're not going to shatter Theron the way the last loss did. And if you need anything at all, find me. The king might be figuring out how to open his heart again, but that doesn't mean everyone will make it easy for you. She'd been right about that. A week into my stay, the council had requested a formal audience with Theron, and he'd asked me to attend. They need to see that you're not just some temporary distraction, he'd explained, though the tension in his jaw suggested he wasn't looking forward to the confrontation. The council chamber was all dark wood and iron fixtures, with a long table where 6 wolves sat, alphas from the most powerful packs in the territories, each one radiating authority and judgment. I'd taken my place slightly behind Theron's chair, trying to project confidence I didn't feel while my wolf cowered under the weight of so much dominant energy. Your Majesty, began Counselor Marcus, a grizzled alpha with frost-white hair and a face like weathered granite. We've been patient, but questions must be asked. This girl from Stonehaven, what are your intentions regarding her? My intentions, Theron had replied coolly, are my own concern. With respect, they are the concern of these territories. Another counselor, a woman named Vivian with silver threading through her black hair, leaned forward. You called a gathering to find a queen. Every unmated female of standing answered your summons, and then you dismissed them all in favor of a supply coordinator with no rank, no connections, no particular strength that we can discern. The words had been meant to wound, and they'd succeeded. I'd felt myself shrinking, felt the old familiar shame trying to surface. But then Theron had stood, and the temperature in the room had dropped. Be very careful, he'd said softly, dangerously, how you speak about her in my presence. The council had exchanged glances, and I'd seen the calculation in their eyes. The weighing of risk versus necessity. We mean no disrespect, Marcus had said carefully. But the territories need stability. They need to know that their king is making decisions based on strategic value, not sentiment. Sentiment. Theron had laughed, and it was the coldest sound I'd ever heard from him. You think sentiment drives me? I, who executed 17 wolves for their betrayal. I, who've expanded our borders through blood and negotiation. You dare suggest I'm compromised by sentiment? Then explain it to us, Vivian had pressed. Make us understand why this particular girl. She's not a girl, I'd interrupted, surprising myself as much as anyone else. 6 pairs of eyes had turned to me, most of them hostile. But I'd found my voice, and something in me had refused to be silent any longer. I'm a wolf. Maybe not the strongest or the fastest or the one anyone would choose first, but I'm not a child to be discussed while standing right here. And I'm not a weakness to be examined and dismissed. The silence that followed had been absolute. You overstep, Counselor Marcus had growled, his alpha aura pressing against me like a physical weight. I'd forced myself not to flinch, even as my wolf had whimpered in submission. Perhaps. But if you're going to judge whether I belong here, at least have the courtesy to speak to me, not about me. Theron had remained perfectly still, but I'd felt something shift in the air, a subtle change in his stance that suggested he was poised to intervene if the council moved against me. Fine, Vivian had said, her sharp eyes assessing me with new interest. Tell us then, what exactly do you bring to this alliance? What value do you offer our king that hundreds of other more suitable candidates could not? It was the question I'd been asking myself since that first day in the library, the question that haunted me every time I caught sight of my reflection and saw nothing remarkable staring back. But standing there with Theron's presence solid and warm behind me, I'd finally understood the answer. I see him, I'd said simply. Not the king, not the legend, not the list of things he's conquered or crushed. I see a wolf who's been alone so long he's forgotten what it feels like to be known. And maybe I'm not a strategic alliance or a political victory, but I'd rather be someone who sees the truth than someone who only sees the crown. The council had exchanged more glances, and I'd known my words hadn't satisfied them, probably had only confirmed their suspicions that I was naive, romantic, completely unsuitable for the realities of ruling. But Theron had placed his hand on my shoulder, a public claim of protection that had sent murmurs around the table, and addressed them with quiet finality. Your concerns are noted. Dismissed. Later, in the privacy of his study, he'd pulled me into his arms without warning, burying his face in my hair while his entire body trembled with an emotion I couldn't name. You stood up to them, he'd murmured against my temple. They could have crushed you with their auras alone, and you stood your ground. I was terrified, I'd admitted, my hands clutching at his shirt. I know. I could sense your fear from across the room. He'd pulled back just enough to look at me, his pale eyes blazing with something fierce and possessive. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is, Lyra. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it silence you. And then he'd kissed me. Not the gentle, tentative kiss I might have expected, but something desperate and claiming, as if he was trying to pour 8 years of loneliness into that single point of connection. I'd responded without thinking, rising onto my toes to meet him, my fingers tangling in his pale hair, while my wolf sang with joy for the first time in my life. When we'd finally broken apart, both breathless, he'd rested his forehead against mine. I don't know if this is the bond, he'd whispered. I don't know if fate has decided to give me a second chance, or if this is something else entirely. But Lyra, when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to want something beyond duty, to hope for something beyond survival. I feel it too, I'd confessed. Like I've been waiting my whole life without knowing what I was waiting for. And now you know, he'd finished, his arms tightening around me. Now I knew. Chapter 4, The Northern Borders. The shift happened gradually, like ice melting into spring. So subtle at first that I almost didn't notice until the warmth had already taken root. Theron began including me in more than just council meetings. He took me to the training yards where his warriors sparred, introduced me to the patrol captains who protected the territory borders, showed me the intricate network of alliances and tensions that held 4 territories together under his rule. At first, the warriors had been skeptical. I could see it in their guarded expressions, the way they'd exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. But I'd never been one to demand respect I hadn't earned. Instead, I'd ask questions, learn their names, their ranks, the routes they patrolled, and the challenges they faced with supply deliveries during harsh weather. When one young warrior had twisted his ankle during drills, I'd stepped forward instinctively, using the practical knowledge I'd gained from years of coordinating medical supplies. The joint had been swollen but not broken, and I'd wrapped it properly, explaining how to care for it and when shifting would accelerate the healing. You've got a steady touch, the warrior, a wolf named Dane with auburn hair and a quick smile, had said with genuine appreciation. And you didn't flinch when I cursed. I've dealt with worse complaints, I'd replied, remembering the countless injuries I'd helped manage in Stonehaven, always working behind the scenes, always invisible until someone needed help. Word had spread after that. When patrols returned with injured wolves, they'd started seeking me out, not because I was the king's whatever I was to him, but because I was efficient and I treated them like they mattered. Kieran had slowly begun to thaw. Not warmly, but with grudging respect. He'd even sought me out one evening when Theron had been locked in a border dispute meeting that stretched past midnight. The king is different with you, he'd said without preamble, leaning against the doorframe of the library where I'd been reading. Softer. More like he was before he lost her. I'd nodded quietly, understanding the weight behind his words. I've served him for 8 years, Kieran had continued, his scarred face unreadable. Watched him become something harder than steel, colder than winter itself. Thought it was what he needed to survive, to rule. But now I wonder if we were wrong. If we pushed him towards strength and forgot that even kings need something to live for beyond duty. You were protecting him the only way you knew how, I'd said, understanding the guilt beneath his confession. Maybe. His eyes had met mine, fierce and assessing. But I've seen him laugh 3 times in the past 2 weeks, Lyra. 3 times. In 8 years before you came, I never heard him laugh once. His voice had dropped lower. Don't make me regret accepting you. Don't break what you've helped him rebuild. The warning had been clear. Hurt Theron, and Kieran would tear me apart, king's protection or not. I won't, I'd promised, meaning it with every fiber of my being. 3 weeks after I'd arrived, Theron asked me to accompany him to the northern border. There had been reports of rogue wolves testing the territory lines, and while it wasn't a major threat, he wanted to make his presence known. Senna had helped me prepare, lending me proper riding clothes since I'd arrived at the fortress with little more than the cloak I'd worn to the gathering. You'll do fine, she'd assured me, braiding my ash-brown hair back in a practical style. Just remember, the pack wolves up north are more traditional. They might test you. Don't let them see weakness. The journey had taken most of the day. I'd ridden beside Theron, flanked by Kieran and 4 guards, through forests that grew denser and wilder the farther north we traveled. He'd pointed out landmarks, telling me stories about skirmishes fought and treaties signed, his voice losing some of its formal edge as the fortress fell farther behind us. "I used to come here as a boy," he'd said when we'd stopped to water the horses at a stream. "Before my father died, before everything changed. I'd slip away from my tutors and run these woods in wolf form for hours, just feeling free." "Do you ever do that anymore?" I'd asked, watching the way sunlight danced on the water. "Just run for the joy of it?" He'd been quiet for a long moment. "No. I stopped allowing myself that kind of freedom. It felt irresponsible. Weak." I'd turned to face him fully. "Or maybe it's what keeps you sane. Maybe that's what you've been missing. Not another strategist or warrior, but someone who reminds you that you're allowed to be more than just a king." His expression had shifted, something vulnerable flickering in his pale eyes. "Is that what you think you're doing? Reminding me?" "I think," I'd said carefully, "that we remind each other. That maybe we both needed someone who could see past what everyone else expects us to be." He'd closed the distance between us then, cupping my face in his hands with a tenderness that still surprised me every time. "I don't deserve you. You don't get to decide that," I'd whispered back. "I do." The kiss had been interrupted by Kieran clearing his throat pointedly, reminding us we had an audience and a schedule to keep. But Theron's hand had found mine as we'd remounted, and he hadn't let go for the rest of the ride. The northern pack's territory had been marked by ancient pines and rocky outcroppings. Their alpha, a massive wolf named Orin with iron-gray hair and eyes like flint, had greeted us with formal respect that bordered on suspicion. "Your Majesty," he'd rumbled, his gaze sliding to me with obvious curiosity. "We weren't told you'd be bringing a guest." "Lyra is under my personal protection," Theron had replied, and though his tone had been even, I'd heard the steel underneath. "She goes where I go." Orin's pack had gathered in a clearing, at least 50 wolves ranging from elderly to young children. They'd watched me with the same wariness I'd grown used to, the "why is she here" confusion, the searching for whatever made me special enough to stand beside their king. The meeting had been tense but productive. Orin had reported the rogue sightings, describing wolves who bore no pack scent and seemed to be testing boundaries deliberately. Theron had authorized increased patrols and promised reinforcements if the situation escalated. But it was what happened after the formal meeting that changed everything. A child had approached me, a little boy no more than 7 with tangled black hair and enormous eyes. He'd been limping, favoring his right leg. When I'd knelt to his level instinctively, he'd whispered, "It hurts." "May I look?" I'd asked gently, and when he'd nodded, I'd examined the leg carefully. A sprain not serious, but painful for someone so small. I'd wrapped it with supplies from my pack, showing his mother how to care for it, explaining what signs to watch for. "Thank you," the mother had said, her eyes welling with tears. "Our supply coordinator moved south last season, and we've been struggling." "I can leave you with some basic medical supplies," I'd offered, "and instructions for common injuries." "It's not much, but it's more than nothing." Orin had interrupted, and when I'd looked up, I'd found him watching me with new assessment. "You're trained in supply management?" "My uncle taught me. I've been coordinating patrol supplies and medical provisions since I was old enough to keep records." Something had shifted in the pack's demeanor after that. More wolves had approached with questions about supply routes that had become inefficient, about how to preserve medicines through harsh winters, about whether certain shortages warranted concern. I'd answered what I could, made notes about resources I could send from the fortress, identified inefficiencies in their distribution systems that could be easily fixed. When we'd finally prepared to leave, Orin had pulled Theron aside. I'd been too far away to hear their conversation, but I'd seen the older alpha's expression soften, seen him glance at me with something that looked almost like approval. On the ride back, with darkness falling around us and stars beginning to emerge overhead, Theron had been unusually quiet. "You're thinking too loud," I'd finally said, guiding my horse closer to his. He'd smiled slightly. "Orin told me something interesting before we left. He said that in all the years he's known me, he's never seen me look at anyone the way I look at you. He said it was like watching someone remember how to be alive." My breath had caught. "And what did you say?" "That he was right." Theron had reached across the space between our horses, taking my hand. "Every moment with you, Lyra, I feel pieces of myself coming back. Pieces I thought were lost forever when she died. It terrifies me because I know what it costs to lose someone you. He'd stopped abruptly, as if the words had gotten stuck. Someone you love, I'd finished softly. The silence had stretched between us, heavy with the weight of what we were both feeling but hadn't yet named. Finally, he'd spoken, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore. Love. I've spent 8 years teaching myself not to feel too deeply, not to want too much. But then you're there, in my library or my study or my training yards, and suddenly I'm wanting things I shouldn't. Imagining futures I have no right to dream about. Like what? I'd asked, my heart hammering. Like waking up next to you every morning. Like watching you interact with my people and knowing you're mine. Like, he'd cut himself off again, shaking his head. Like things that make me vulnerable in ways a king can't afford. I'd understood the fear beneath his words. He'd lost his mate once, had survived it by becoming something harder, colder. Opening himself to that possibility again meant risking the kind of pain that had nearly destroyed him the first time. I'm scared too, I'd admitted. Every day I wake up expecting you to realize I'm not enough. That I'm still just the overlooked niece from Stonehaven, who doesn't bring you anything except complications and counsel complaints. He'd pulled his horse to a stop, and when I'd done the same, he'd dismounted and pulled me down beside him. The guards had continued ahead, giving us space, understanding without being told that this moment was private. You bring me hope, he'd said fiercely, his hands framing my face. You bring me laughter and light, and the possibility that maybe I don't have to spend the rest of my life alone in my own fortress. You bring me back to myself, Lyra. Don't you understand? You're not a complication. You're the first thing in 8 years that's made sense. The confession had broken something open inside me, and I'd found myself crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered. I think I'm falling in love with you, I'd whispered against his chest. I know it's too soon, I know we barely know each other, but it's not too soon. His arms had tightened around me. It's been happening since that first moment in the ballroom, when you looked at me without flinching. When you saw past the crown and the reputation and all the walls I'd built, and somehow still decided I was worth your time. We'd stood there in the forest, holding each other while the night deepened around us, and I'd felt something click into place. Not the bond, not yet, but something just as powerful. A choice we were both making despite the fear, despite the complications, despite everything that could go wrong. When we'd finally pulled apart, his eyes had been bright with unshed tears. Whatever comes next, he'd said quietly, I want you to know you've already changed everything. Chapter 5, Blood and Bonds. The bond snapped into place 4 days later, and it happened in the most unexpected way possible. I'd been in the supply room, a space I'd claimed as my own over the past month, organizing inventory and coordinating shipments to the Northern Pack. Senna had been there too, helping me sort through medical provisions while complaining good-naturedly about Kieran's overprotective tendencies. He acts like I'm made of glass, she'd said, stacking bundles of bandages. I've been fighting since before he learned to shift, but suddenly I need an escort to walk across the courtyard. He cares about you, I'd replied, checking items off my list. That's not the worst thing. No, she'd agreed with a soft smile. It's not. Before she could continue, shouting had erupted from somewhere deeper in the fortress. Urgent, panicked voices that sent ice through my veins. Kieran had burst through the supply room door seconds later, his face ashen beneath his scars. It's the king, he'd gasped. The rogues, they were a distraction. There's been an attack inside the fortress. I hadn't waited to hear the rest. My feet had carried me through corridors I'd learned by heart, following the scent of blood and the sound of chaos. The throne room doors had been thrown open, and inside, Theron had been on his knees, surrounded by his guards, with blood soaking through his shirt. Not a mortal wound, I'd realized with the quick assessment I'd learned from years of supply coordination, but serious enough. A blade had caught him across the shoulder and upper chest, deep and vicious. 4 dead rogues had been sprawled across the stone floor, testament to how the fight had ended. But it was his eyes that had stopped me cold. He'd looked up as I'd entered, and in that moment of vulnerability, king brought low, defenses shattered, mortality laid bare, something had ignited between us. The bond had crashed over me like an avalanche. Every nerve ending had suddenly been alive with the knowledge of him. I'd felt his pain as if it were my own, felt the exhaustion dragging at his consciousness, felt the desperate relief flooding through him at the sight of me. And underneath it all, a connection so profound it had driven me to my knees beside him. "Mate," my wolf had whispered with absolute certainty. "Ours." "Lyra," he'd breathed, and I'd heard the same recognition in his voice, seen it blazing in his pale eyes. "Let me help," I'd managed, though my hands had been shaking. The bond thrummed between us, demanding I touch him, help him, make the pain stop. I'd press my hands against the wound, feeling the warmth of his blood, the rapid beat of his heart beneath my palms. The fortress healers had arrived then, pushing through the crowd, but Theron had caught my wrist. "No. Her. I want her." So I'd worked, barking orders for supplies I knew we had in inventory, for water and clean cloth and the strong thread used for deep wounds. My hands had been steady as I'd cleaned the gash, as I'd stitched it closed with careful precision while the bond sang between us, while his pain became mine, and my determination to save him became his anchor. "You feel it," he'd said when I'd finally finished, his voice rough with emotion and residual pain. "Yes." I'd met his eyes, my hand still pressed against the bandage covering his shoulder. "I feel everything." The throne room had emptied at Kieran's barked command, leaving us alone with the dead rogues and the blood-stained floor. Theron had pulled me into his lap despite his injury, despite protocol, despite everything that said a king shouldn't be vulnerable. 8 years, he'd whispered against my hair. I waited 8 years believing I'd never feel this again, that the bond had judged me and found me unworthy of a second chance. "You're not unworthy," I'd said fiercely, careful not to jar his injury. "You've never been unworthy. You were just waiting, like I was. For this. For me." His arms had tightened around me. "I was waiting for you, and I didn't even know it." The implications had settled over both of us gradually. This wasn't just attraction or growing affection. This was fate itself declaring that we belonged together, that somehow, impossibly, the bond had chosen to give us both what we'd been missing. "The council," I'd started, but he'd silenced me with a kiss that tasted like blood and desperation and promise. "The council," he'd said when we'd finally broken apart, "will accept what I tell them to accept. You're my mate, Lyra. Not a political alliance, not a strategic choice. My mate. And anyone who has a problem with that can challenge me directly." I'd laughed despite the tears streaming down my face. "You're injured. Maybe save the death threats for when you can actually stand." "I'll always stand for you," he'd replied with absolute certainty. "Even when I'm on my knees." The following days had been a whirlwind of preparations and adjustments. The bond ceremony had been planned with a speed that left the council scrambling, but Theron had been immovable. "I've waited 8 years, he'd told them flatly. "I won't wait another day longer than necessary." Mira had come to the fortress for the ceremony, not out of familial affection, but because refusing a king's invitation would have been politically disastrous. She'd looked at me with barely concealed envy, her perfect features tight with resentment. "I don't understand how you did it," she'd hissed during a brief moment alone. "You're nothing special, Lyra. You never have been." For once, her words hadn't cut. I'd looked at my cousin, beautiful, strong, everything a wolf was supposed to be, and felt only pity. "You're right," I'd said quietly. "I'm not special in the ways you value. But I'm exactly what he needed, and that's worth more than any amount of strength or status could ever be." The ceremony itself had been held in the fortress courtyard under a full moon. Traditional but intimate. Only pack members Theron trusted completely. Only wolves who'd earned their place through loyalty rather than rank. Senna had stood beside me as my witness, her hand warm in mine, while Kieran had stood for Theron. When the time had come to recite the ancient vows, Theron's voice had been steady despite the emotion I could feel thrumming through our bond. "I, Theron Frost, claim you, Lyra Shenvale, as my mate, my equal, my partner, my queen. I vow to protect you with my life, to honor you with my truth, to love you with everything I am. From this moment until my last breath, you are mine as I am yours." My own vows had come through tears. "I, Lyra Shenvale, accept your claim and offer my own. I choose you, Theron Frost, not for your crown or your power, but for the wolf beneath it all. I vow to stand beside you, to challenge you when you need it, to comfort you when you allow it. From this moment until my last breath, you are mine as I am yours." The bond had solidified as we'd sealed the vows with a kiss, and I'd felt it. The snap of completion, the sense of two souls recognizing they'd finally found home. Every wolf present had felt it too, the power of a true mating bond settling into place, and I'd heard the collective intake of breath, the whispered acknowledgement that this was real. That night, in the privacy of chambers that were now ours rather than just his, Theron had held me close and whispered confessions into the darkness. I used to dream about her, he'd said, his fingers tracing patterns on my bare shoulder. About my first mate. I'd wake up, and the loss would hit me all over again. But since you've been here, since the bond formed, I don't dream about her anymore. I dream about you, about our future, about the life we're going to build together. Does that make you feel guilty? I'd asked, understanding the complexity of loving someone new after loss. It did at first, he'd admitted. But then I realized she would have wanted this for me. Would have wanted me to be happy again, to love again. And loving you doesn't diminish what we had. It just means I was lucky enough to be chosen twice. I'd turned in his arms, meeting his eyes in the moonlight streaming through the windows. I'll spend every day proving I'm worth that choice. You already have, he'd replied, pulling me closer. Just by being exactly who you are. Chapter 6, Proving Ground. The months that followed brought their own challenges. The rogues who'd attacked had been part of a larger group testing the territories, and Theron had been forced to deal with them decisively. But now, when he left for patrols or negotiations, I felt him through the bond. His determination, his occasional frustration, the warm pulse of love that he sent back to me across whatever distance separated us. I'd taken on responsibilities as queen that surprised everyone, myself included. The Northern Pack's request for supply coordination assistance had been the first. Oren had asked specifically for my guidance in establishing better distribution systems. I'd spent a week there, reorganizing their inventory methods and training volunteers from his pack, and when I'd returned, 2 other packs had made similar requests. You're creating something, Senna had observed one afternoon while I'd organized shipments to the Eastern Territory. She was sharpening her daggers. A familiar ritual I'd learned meant she was thinking deeply. A network of coordination across all the territories, resources being shared instead of hoarded. Is that allowed? I'd asked, suddenly uncertain. I never asked permission. It's brilliant, she'd interrupted firmly. And it's exactly what these territories need. You're not just the king's mate, Lyra. You're becoming a queen in your own right. The council had come around eventually, though some more reluctantly than others. Marcus had been the first to acknowledge that my influence had strengthened rather than weakened Theron's rule. The packs trust you, he'd admitted grudgingly during a council meeting. They see you working with their coordinators, improving their supply lines, and they remember that their king chose someone who cares about more than power. Even Mira had eventually written a stiff, formal letter congratulating me on my position and asking if there might be opportunities for Stonehaven wolves to train with the fortress supply teams. I'd read between the lines. She was asking for help, for connection, for a way back into my life now that I was someone worth knowing. I'd written back with an invitation. Not because I'd forgotten her cruelty, but because I'd learned that strength sometimes meant being bigger than the wounds others had inflicted. 6 months after the bond had formed, Theron found me in the library. Our library, as I now thought of it, reviewing reports from the various coordination hubs I'd helped establish. Come with me, he'd said, offering his hand. I want to show you something. He'd led me through the fortress and out to the northern woods, to the stream where we'd stopped on that first trip together. The sun had been setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the forest had been alive with evening sounds. Do you remember what you asked me here? He'd said, pulling me close. About whether I ever just ran for the joy of it? I remember. I'd smiled against his chest, breathing in his scent, pine and frost and home. I want to run with you, he'd whispered. Not as king and queen. Not with guards or protocol or duties weighing us down. Just us. Just 2 wolves who found each other against all odds. We'd shifted together, our wolves emerging in a synchronicity that the bond made effortless. His wolf was massive and pale, all coiled power and predatory grace. Mine was still small and gray-furred, still carried those uncertain movements that had marked me as weak in Stonehaven. But as we'd run through those woods together, his pale form matching pace with my smaller one, both of us finally free, I'd understood what I'd been too blind to see before. My supposed weakness had been my greatest strength all along. The quiet competence that others had mistaken for insignificance had been exactly what was needed to reach a king who'd forgotten how to trust gentle touches. The organizational skills that my pack had dismissed as mere clerical work had become the foundation of cooperation across 4 territories. The patience that had seemed like passivity had been what allowed me to wait for a love worth having. We'd run until the moon had risen full and bright, until we'd both been breathless and exhilarated, until we'd collapsed together in a clearing and shifted back to human form, tangled in each other's arms and laughing with pure joy. I love you, Theron had said, his pale eyes shining in the moonlight. I loved you before the bond formed, and I'll love you long after we're both dust. You saved me, Lyra. Saved me from a life where I was nothing but duty and darkness. You saved me too, I'd replied, my fingers tracing the scar on his shoulder from that attack, the wound that had brought the bond snapping into focus. You taught me that being overlooked didn't mean I was worthless. That sometimes the right person sees exactly what everyone else missed. We'd lain there under the stars, two wolves who'd found their way home to each other, and I'd felt nothing but gratitude for every moment of pain and loneliness that had led me to this clearing, this man, this life. The territories flourished. Border skirmishes decreased as packs found common ground through shared resources. Supply coordination hubs became gathering places where wolves from different territories could meet and trade not just goods, but knowledge and friendship. Kieran had pulled me aside one evening, his scarred face softer than I'd ever seen it. I was wrong about you, he'd said simply. I thought you'd make him weak. Instead, you've made him, and all of us, stronger in ways I didn't know we needed. Children were born into this new era of cooperation. Senna and Kieran welcomed a daughter they named Arya, and I'd held her in my arms while Senna recovered, marveling at how something so small could represent so much hope. And through it all, Theron and I remained what we'd been from that first moment in the library. Two wolves who'd chosen each other, who'd fought for each other, who'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely love is the one that changes everything. Chapter 7. Legacy of the Overlooked. Years later, when young wolves would come to me asking how I'd won the Frost King's heart, I would always tell them the truth. I hadn't won anything. We'd simply recognized each other in a crowded ballroom. Two souls who understood what it meant to be alone, who knew the value of being truly seen. The fortress had changed in the decades since that gathering. The cold stone halls now echoed with laughter more often than commands. The throne room where I'd first felt the bond snap into place had become a gathering space where pack representatives met quarterly to discuss resource sharing and coordinate responses to threats. Theron had changed too, though the transformation had been so gradual I sometimes forgot how cold he'd been when we first met. He smiled easily now, especially when watching me work with the coordination teams. The walls he'd built so carefully had come down brick by brick, replaced with something stronger, trust built on love and partnership. You're doing it again, he said one morning, finding me in our chambers staring out at the courtyard where a group of young wolves were being taught supply management techniques. Doing what? I turned to face him, still marveling even after all these years at how his expression softened when he looked at me. Thinking too much about what others need instead of what you want. He crossed to me, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind. Some things never change. I want this, I replied, leaning back against his chest. Watching them learn, knowing that what we built will outlast us. That's what I want. Through our bond, I felt his love wash over me like a warm wave. Have I told you today that you're remarkable? Not since breakfast, I teased. Unacceptable. Let me remedy that immediately. He turned me in his arms, his pale eyes dancing with mischief and affection. You, Lyra Frost, are remarkable. You've taken 4 territories that barely tolerated each other and woven them into something that actually resembles a unified kingdom. You've made supply coordination, into something wolves actually volunteer for. Are you going to list my accomplishments all morning? I interrupted, reaching up to brush a strand of pale hair from his forehead. Because the council meeting starts in an hour. Let them wait, he murmured, kissing me softly. The king is busy reminding his mate that she's the best decision he ever made. The council meeting that day brought unexpected news. Marcus had announced his retirement, recommending his daughter to take his place. Vivian had proposed a formal alliance with a neighboring territory that had previously remained neutral, citing the success of our resource-sharing networks as evidence that cooperation benefited everyone. But it was the final item on the agenda that surprised me most. There's been a request, Kieran said, his scarred face betraying nothing though I sensed amusement through the bond I'd developed with Senna over the years. From the Southern Territories. They've heard about Queen Lyra's coordination systems and wanna, I believe the exact words were, borrow her expertise for a few months. Theron had stiffened beside me, and I felt his immediate rejection through our bond before he even spoke. Absolutely not. The Queen isn't. The Queen can speak for herself, I interrupted gently, placing my hand on his arm. Through our bond, I sent reassurance and love. And the Queen thinks it's an excellent opportunity to extend our networks even further. Lyra, I'll take a team, I continued, addressing the council. train their coordinators, establish systems that work for their unique challenges. 3 months at most, with regular check-ins. I looked at Theron, letting him see the certainty in my eyes. And my mate can visit whenever he misses me too much to function. Despite his concern, his lips twitched. That would be daily. Then I suppose you'll be traveling south quite often, Your Majesty. The council had approved the plan, though Theron had spent the rest of the day finding reasons to keep me close, his possessiveness showing in the way he'd pulled me into empty corridors for stolen kisses, and how his hand had never left mine during dinner. 3 months, he'd muttered that night as we'd prepared for bed. Do you know how long 3 months is? Approximately 90 days. I'd replied innocently, then squeaked as he'd pulled me onto the bed beside him. You're insufferable. You love me anyway. I do, he'd agreed, his voice dropping to that low rumble that still sent shivers down my spine. More than I thought possible, which is why the thought of you being that far away for that long makes me want to lock you in this tower and never let you leave. I'd cupped his face in my hands, making him meet my eyes. You won't though. Because you know that part of why we work is that we let each other be who we are. You're the king who rules with strength and strategy. I'm the queen who connects and coordinates. Together, we're building something that will last long after we're gone. I know, he'd whispered. Doesn't mean I have to like it. Then visit often. Bring Kieran and Senna. Make it a diplomatic tour. Show the southern territories that the Frost King's reach extends everywhere. He'd smiled then, that full, genuine smile that I'd learned to treasure. You're too clever for your own good. You love that about me too. I love everything about you, he'd said, and then he'd shown me exactly how much, the bond singing between us until we'd both forgotten about distances and separations, and everything except each other. The trip south had been exactly what I'd expected, challenging, rewarding, and ultimately successful. I'd established coordination hubs, trained volunteers, and built relationships that would strengthen the territories for generations. And true to his word, Theron had visited every 2 weeks, sometimes staying only a day, sometimes a week. Each time, he'd brought news from home, updates on the northern packs, stories about Arya and the other children being raised in this new era of cooperation. On my final week before returning home, Oren had arrived from the Northern Territory with an unexpected request. We'd like to propose something, he'd said during a formal dinner. A permanent council position focused entirely on resource coordination and interpack cooperation. We believe Queen Lyra has proven this role is essential to our continued prosperity. I'd looked at Theron, who'd been present for this particular visit, and saw pride shining in his pale eyes. What does my mate think? He'd asked, deferring to me in a way that still made my heart swell even after all these years. I think, I'd said slowly, that I'd be honored. But I'd want to train others to do this work too. To build a system that doesn't depend on any one person. Even better, Oren had agreed. You'll teach them to be like you. Later, when we'd been alone, Theron had pulled me close. A council position, queen and royal coordinator, has a nice ring to it. Does it bother you? I'd asked. That I'm building something separate from you? Bother me? He'd laughed. Lyra, watching you grow into your power, into your purpose, it's one of my greatest joys. You're not building something separate. You're building our legacy. The Frost King who learned to love, and the overlooked queen who taught an entire kingdom to cooperate. Together, we're proving that strength comes in many forms. We'd returned to the fortress together, and I'd been surprised by the welcome that awaited us. The courtyard had been filled with wolves from all 4 territories, warriors and coordinators, pack leaders and volunteers, all gathered to celebrate not just my return, but what we'd all built together. Kieran had stepped forward first, Senna beside him with Arya on her hip. Welcome home, my queen, he'd said formally, then broken protocol entirely by embracing me. We missed you. Even I'll admit it. Especially you, Senna had corrected with a grin. He's been insufferable, constantly asking Theron when you'd return. The celebration had lasted long into the night. Stories had been shared, bonds strengthened, and I'd realized something profound as I'd watched wolves from different territories laughing together, working together, building something together. This was what I'd been meant to do. Not just be Theron's mate, though that remained the foundation of everything, but to show that the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones dismissed as weak or insignificant could change the world in ways that strength and dominance never could. Years continued to pass. The coordination networks expanded. Young wolves who'd grown up in this era of cooperation began taking leadership roles, bringing fresh ideas and even stronger connections. Mira eventually came to visit, humbler than she'd been, and we'd built something that almost resembled a real relationship. She'd admitted that watching me succeed had forced her to reconsider what strength really meant. I always thought being strong meant being the best fighter, she'd confessed during a walk through the gardens. But you've changed entire territories without ever throwing a single punch. That's a kind of power I never understood. The council meeting where they'd formally recognized the Royal Coordination Office as a permanent institution had been one of my proudest moments. Not because of the title or recognition, but because it meant the work would continue long after I was gone. Theron had stood beside me as always, his hand in mine, and addressed the assembled leaders. 10 years ago, I called a gathering believing I needed to find someone to stand beside me, he'd said, his voice carrying across the chamber. I was wrong. I didn't need someone to stand beside me. I needed someone who would walk her own path and show me that true strength isn't about standing alone. It's about building connections that make everyone stronger. He'd turned to me then, love and pride shining in his pale eyes. My mate taught me that, and in teaching me, she taught all of us. The overlooked daughter became the queen who changed everything. Now, in the quiet moments when I walked the fortress halls or worked in the library we still considered our refuge, I often reflected on that terrified girl who'd stood in a ballroom convinced she had nothing to offer. She'd been wrong. So wrong. Her gentleness had been her strength. Her patience had been her power. Her ability to see value in others, including a broken king who'd forgotten how to hope, had been exactly what the world needed. When young wolves came asking for my secret, asking how someone like me had achieved so much, I always gave them the same answer. I was brave enough to be myself, even when everyone said that self wasn't enough. I chose to see value where others saw weakness, to build bridges where others saw divisions, to believe in connection when the world demanded dominance. I'd pause, letting them absorb that, then add, sometimes that's the only worthiness that matters. Not being what others expect, but being exactly who you are and finding someone, or something, that needs exactly that. The overlooked daughter had found her voice. The cold king had found his heart. And together, we'd built a legacy that would outlast us both. One of compassion, courage, and the revolutionary idea that true power isn't about dominance or strength or even destiny. It's about choosing love, even when fear would be easier. It's about building bridges when walls would be safer. It's about recognizing that being overlooked doesn't mean being worthless. Sometimes it just means you're exactly what the world needs, even if the world doesn't know it yet. And as I stood in the library one evening, Theron's arms around me while we watched the sun set over our territories, I knew with absolute certainty that every moment of loneliness, every instance of being dismissed or underestimated, every doubt and fear had been worth it, because it had led me here, to him, to us, to this legacy we'd built together, the Frost King and his overlooked queen. Proof that sometimes the most powerful magic isn't in bonds or destiny or fate. It's in two broken souls deciding to heal each other, one gentle moment at a time. The end.